I stood outside my son's house on my grandson's birthday. My son blocked the doorway and said firmly, "Dad, wait outside. This party is for family." I didn't argue. I handed him a small envelope. "Open it later," I said. He stared at me silently for a moment, then took it. That night at exactly 11:47 p.m., my phone exploded with notifications. 98 missed calls, texts, voicemails. Every alert reminded him that the choices he thought were buried in the past had finally caught up with him. For the first time in years, I was holding all the cards. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between teaching someone a hard lesson or simply walking away? Just yes or no is fine. Your answer might help someone else facing the same choice. Quick note, some details here are fictionalized for storytelling, but the lesson is what I hope stays with you. My name is Harlan Ross, 68 years old, and I spent 35 years teaching algebra to teenagers who believed equations were punishment. I know exactly when a problem has been miscalculated, and on the afternoon of my grandson's 8th birthday, my son stood in his own doorway and told me this wasn't the place for me tonight. But that was evening. The morning started differently. At 8 o'clock, I stood in my one-bedroom apartment on Morse Road in northeast Columbus, ironing a polyester vest with the precision of a man who understood that even small variables matter in the final equation. The iron hissed against the fabric steam rising toward the kitchen ceiling. I'd owned this vest for 12 years. It had outlasted my marriage, my career, and my son's willingness to return phone calls without a 3-day delay. I set the iron upright and opened the narrow desk drawer beside my bed. Inside, beneath utility bills and grocery receipts, sat a small spiral notebook with a blue cover. I flipped it open to the page I'd been maintaining. For 2 years, 14 entries, 14 times. I counted them the way I counted mistakes on algebra exams, without emotion, only accuracy. May 2021 Mother's Day brunch. Desmond posted photos on social media. I was not invited. July 2021, Lachlan's 6th birthday. I learnt about it 4 days later. November 2021, Thanksgiving dinner with Wallace Ashford. My place setting did not exist. The list continued in blue ballpoint ink. Each entry numbered, each date verified. I was a vice principal for 17 years before I retired. Documentation is not revenge. It is evidence that a pattern exists. I closed the notebook and returned it to the drawer. 3 weeks earlier, my grandson had called me. Lachlan Ross, 8 years old as of today, had asked in his clear voice if I was coming to his birthday party. I told him I wouldn't miss it. He asked if I was bringing a robot kit. I said I'd see what I could find. I didn't tell him I already knew the party was happening. I didn't tell him I also knew I wouldn't be invited by his father. I didn't go to that house to be let in. I went so that the letter would have a reason to exist. The gift sat on my counter wrapped in blue paper, a Lego robotic starter set $43 after tax. I'd kept the receipt. I spent the morning polishing my shoes. Old Clark's brown leather, the kind men wore when a single pair had to last 5 years. I worked the polish in small circles, buffing until the leather caught the light. Have you ever ironed a vest, knowing you'd be turned away at the door? Polished shoes that would never cross a threshold I have. There is a particular dignity in preparing yourself immaculately for your own public rejection. It removes variables when they turn you away. They cannot say you weren't presentable. They can only own what they did. At 6:15 that evening, I drove my 2009 Honda Civic West toward Upper Arlington, where property values and courtesy both increased with every mile. Autumn darkness was settling over Columbus. The trees along Desmond Street were red maples, their leaves brilliant against the dimming sky. I parked on the street. A black Mercedes sat in the driveway closest to the front door. Wallace Ashford, 71, a retired senior vice president from Fifth Third Bank's commercial lending division, had been my son's mentor for a decade. The car's placement was not accidental. I took the white envelope from the passenger seat. It was thick, containing 4 pages I had written in longhand the night before. I walked up the driveway. The brick pathway had been recently power washed. Through the tall windows, I could see people moving inside, hear the low hum of conversation and a child's laughter. I rang the doorbell. Desmond Ross, my 41-year-old son and CEO of Ross Commercial Properties, opened the door holding a wine glass. He wore a grey cardigan and the carefully arranged expression of a man who'd been caught miscalculating a problem he desperately hoped would solve itself. "Dad," he said, just the one word. Behind him I could see the dining room archway. Wallace sat at the head of the table, with silver hair, and the kind of polite smile that accountants learnt to recognize as compound interest on contempt. He was watching us. I glanced up. In the second-floor window, Lachlan Ross, my 8-year-old grandson, stood with his face pressed against the glass, holding an iPad he didn't yet know would become the most important piece of evidence in the entire equation. He waved. I lifted my hand in return. "Happy birthday to Lachlan," I said. I held out the gift. Desmond looked at this blue-wrapped box, but didn't take it. "Dad, this isn't a good time. It's a family dinner. I'll call you tomorrow." Family dinner. I had been teaching long enough to recognize when a phrase was deployed as a barrier, rather than a description. "I understand," I said. I set the gift on the porch bench beside the door. Then I drew the white envelope from my jacket pocket and held it out. Desmond took it. His fingers touched mine for half a second. "Open it when they're gone," I said. He stared at the envelope. My name was written on the front in my own handwriting for Desmond. "Dad," I turned and walked back down the driveway. My son's hand never left the doorframe, as if I might try to force my way in, as if a 68-year-old math teacher posed a threat to his expensive threshold. The cold air smelled like wood smoke and wet leaves. Behind me the door closed. With a soft click, I reached my car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Through the trees I could still see the house lit gold against the October night. Lachlan's window was dark now. Desmond stood on the porch holding the white envelope unopened, watching my silhouette disappear down the maple-lined driveway into the darkness. He had no idea what was inside. Neither did Wallace, sitting at the head of the table 8 feet away, already calculating his next move. By morning, 98 missed calls would be waiting on my phone, and not one of them would be an apology. I drove home in silence that night, watching the red tail lights of Upper Arlington fade into the ordinary grid of northeast Columbus. By the time I reached my apartment on Morse Road, my phone was already vibrating with incoming calls. I powered it off and set it face down on the nightstand. The envelope tore open at 11:47 p.m. in a kitchen lit only by under-cabinet LEDs. And what fell out was not a letter, it was a ledger. Desmond had waited until his wife Simone went upstairs, before sliding the white envelope from his jacket pocket. He stood alone in their granite kitchen, the party debris still scattered across the counter. Wine bottles, dessert plates, a half-eaten birthday cake with blue frosting. Through the archway, he could still see Wallace's wine glass on the dining table, lipstick stained abandoned. He tore the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in 4. Not a letter, not an emotional plea, a financial autopsy. At the top, written in my handwriting with a blue ballpoint pen, was a heading loan summary and status. Below it, itemized, principal $370,000. Interest rate 3.5% per annum. Origination date October 14th, 2020. Security first position. Lien recorded Franklin County. Book 47082, page 331. Franklin County Recorder's Office, filed October 14, 2020, payments received, 2 months, November 2020, December 2020, payments missed 14 months. Consecutive delinquency, January 2021 to present, current balance, due $383,847.19, including accrued interest. At the bottom of the page beneath the numbers, I had written a single sentence in the same careful handwriting. "The door you closed tonight was the last courtesy I had left to give. The rest is in the record." Desmond read it twice. Then he ran upstairs. Simone was already in bed, her back to the door, the bedside lamp extinguished. He grabbed his phone from the charger and went into the hallway. Bathroom, locking the door behind him. He called me. No answer. He called again. No answer. Again. Again. "Dad, pick up. Dad, please. I need to talk to you. Call me back." Have you ever called someone in 98 times in a single night, knowing with absolute certainty they can hear the phone ring and are choosing silence? By 2 a.m., Desmond was sitting on the bathroom floor with his back against the tub, the white paper in one hand and his phone in the other, staring at the call log that stretched across 3 screens. I woke at 7 the next morning in my one-bedroom apartment and made coffee in the same 4-cup percolator I'd owned since 1987. The phone was still powered off on the nightstand. I sat at my small Formica table by the window and drank from a chipped mug that said "World's Best Teacher," a gift from a student in 2003 whose name I could no longer remember. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel righteous. I felt like a man who had spent 8 years documenting a mathematical proof and had finally written the conclusion at the bottom of the page. The money had started small. 6 years ago, when Lachlan was 2, Desmond had asked for $15,000. A bridge loan, he called it. Cash flow timing issue. I wrote the check without a contract, without a timeline, without security. He was my son. That is what fathers do. He never paid it back. He also never mentioned it again. Then 3 years ago, in October 2020, he arrived at my door at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I was still living in the house than the ancestral home in East Columbus that my father had built in 1967, the one I'd raised Desmond in after his mother died. Desmond stood on the porch holding a leather folder, and when I opened the door, I saw that his hands were shaking. "I need help," he said. He spread the papers across my kitchen table. Corporate insolvency documents, foreclosure notices, a debt schedule showing Ross Commercial, properties owed creditors $1.2 million and had liquid assets of $740,000. The exact delta between survival and bankruptcy was $370,000, and the banks had given him 6 weeks. I did not ask why. I did not ask how. I asked when he needed it. By the end of the month, he said, I called Thaddeus Thornton at 11 that same night. Thaddeus, my college roommate for 46 years and the sharpest real estate attorney in Franklin County, answered without asking a single question. That is the definition of friendship measured across nearly half a century. "I need to borrow against the house." I told him, $370,000 as fast as possible. "I'll draft the agreement tonight," he said. "You'll have it in 55 hours. 2 days later, Thaddeus arrived at my door with a stack of papers bound in blue backing. The loan agreement was 12 pages, standard terms, reasonable interest, first position lien on the property to secure repayment. Everything looked ordinary. He handed me a pen and pointed to the signature lines. "Harlan," he said, "I added something you didn't ask for. Trust me on this one." I looked at him. "What did you add?" "Paragraph 14, he said. "Just a protective clause. Sign it." I taught mathematics for 35 years. I know when an equation contains a hidden variable, but Thaddeus had been my friend. since we were 22 years old. And I trusted him the way you trust a man who has never once failed you. I signed without reading paragraph 14 and full. I believed he was simply being cautious. I believed it was standard legal protection. I was wrong on both counts. Paragraph 14 was the hidden variable I signed my name to without fully understanding, until the day I needed to understand it. I used to tell my students when an equation has two unknown variables, always solved for the more dangerous one first. But back then, I thought the danger was the debt, not the clause protecting me from my own grace. I refinanced the house. The bank released $370,000. I handed Desmond a cashier's check on October 14, 2020. He promised to pay me back within 2 years. He made 2 payments, November and December, and then the money stopped. The calls became less frequent. The invitations disappeared. And 14 months later, I was standing on his porch, being told I didn't belong at my own grandson's birthday party. My phone sat face down on my nightstand, powered completely off. The digital silence, swallowing 98 missed calls like equations I had no intention of solving tonight. Desmond would call Thaddeus next, desperate for answers. He would get none because the only attorney in Ohio who knew what paragraph 14 truly contained was the man who'd written it 46 years into a friendship built on knowing when to protect someone from themselves. I kept the phone off for 3 days. By the time I powered it back on, the voicemail inbox was full, and the missed call log had stopped counting. But to understand why I could sit in that silence without flinching, you need to go back 3 years. 3 years before the envelope, before the ledger, before the doorway, my son arrived at my house at 10 p.m. on an October night in 2020, carrying a manila folder and the look of a man who'd miscalculated an equation he couldn't solve alone. I was still living in the ancestral home, then the 3-bedroom house in East Columbus that my father had built in 1967. The kitchen had the original wooden tables scarred from decades of homework and tax returns. I was grading student essays when the doorbell rang. Desmond stood on the porch under the yellow bug light, his tie loosened, shirt wrinkled. He was 38 and the CEO of Ross Commercial Properties, but he looked like the teenager who'd failed his first algebra exam. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He walked straight to the kitchen table and sat down the folder. "Dad, do you have $370,000? He said. "Because if I don't pay the bank in 6 weeks, they liquidate the company." I sat down across from him. "Show me the papers." Inside were corporate documents stamped with law firm letterheads and a loan agreement with Fifth Third Bank's commercial lending division. The highlighted figure read $370,000. Due November 30th, 2020. I read through them with the precision I'd used grading 35 years of algebra exams. The story was simple and devastating. 2 years earlier, Desmond had taken a commercial loan to acquire a strip mall property. The bank required revenue projections. Desmond had provided them. They were inflated, not fraudulent, just optimistic in the way desperate men are optimistic when they need something badly enough to believe their own calculations. The property underperformed. Covenant violations triggered. The bank demanded full repayment within 90 days. That was 12 weeks ago. Desmond had spent 6 weeks trying to refinance. No one would touch it. "You signed a contract whose terms you didn't understand," I said, "and you waited until 6 weeks before foreclosure to tell me." "I thought I could fix it," he said quietly. "I thought if I just found the right lender." "You thought wrong," I said. For the first time in years, I saw my son without the corporate armor. Just a man who'd gambled and lost. "When you helped me," he asked. I looked at the number again, $370,000. I had been teaching public school since 1985. My salary had never exceeded $58,000 a year. I'd been retired for 3 years on a pension of $42,000 annually. Have you ever sat across from your own child and watched them realize they've gambled away more money than you earned in 8 years of teaching? I have. There is a specific kind of silence that follows that realization. Not shame exactly, but the cold mathematics of understanding that the person you're asking to save you has already given you everything they had, and you're asking them to give more. I'll need to see the exact terms, I said. The full covenant schedule, the property appraisal, and I need you to tell me if there's anyone else you owe money to. There's no one else, he said. Just the bank. Just this. The next hour calculating. The house I was sitting in, the one my father built, the one I'd raised. Desmond, in after his mother died, had a market value of approximately $280,000. I owned it outright. No mortgage. If I sold it, I could net close to that after closing costs. That left $90,000. Alongside my defined benefit pension from STRS Ohio, I had maintained a supplemental 403(b) account. Since 1992, the kind most Ohio teachers carry as a secondary retirement vehicle. My vested balance in that account was $180,000. Under IRS Code Section 72 PI, could borrow up to 50% of that balance, exactly $90,000, and repay it over 5 years through automatic bank drafts. But $280,000 plus $90,000 equals $370,000. The equation balanced. I can do it, I said. Desmond looked up. How? I sell this house, I said, and I take the maximum loan against my pension that federal law allows. It's exactly enough. Dad, you can't sell the house. This is where you live. This is where I grew up. I'm aware, I said. The house had belonged to my father, and his father before him, 3 generations of Sunday dinners around that wooden table. And I was about to sign it away to rescue a son who'd hidden the crisis until 6 weeks remained. But that is what fathers do. We don't ask if the cost is fair. We ask if the arithmetic works. I'll call my attorney tonight. I said, we'll need a loan agreement between us. Formal documentation. This isn't a gift, Desmond. This is a loan, and you'll pay it back. I will, he said. I promise. I nodded. I wanted to believe him. But I'd been teaching long enough to know the difference between a student who promises to study harder and a student who actually opens the textbook. Promises are just sentences. Behavior is proof. I called Thaddeus at 11 p.m. He answered on the very first ring. That is why we have been friends for 46 years. I need paperwork for a loan, I said, $370,000, secured by real property, between me and Desmond. I'll have it ready in 55 hours, he said. No questions, no judgment, just the instant machinery of friendship. I hung up and sat, alone in the kitchen. Outside, the October wind rattled the window panes. Desmond had already left, driving back to Upper Arlington, with the relief of a drowning man who'd been thrown a rope. I told him the number, 370,000. He said he'd have the paperwork ready in 55 hours. Neither of us mentioned that the only way to raise that capital was to erase everything I'd built across 65 years of life. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't understand until 3 years later, was that Thaddeus was already drafting a clause I never asked for, designed to protect me from the exact scenario I was walking into blind. 55 hours later, 2 printed copies of the loan agreement sat on Thaddeus's worn wooden desk in German Village, each one thick enough to reshape a family's future, and buried on page 7 was a clause I wouldn't understand until the day I needed it most. The office smelled like old paper and coffee. Thaddeus had been practicing real estate law in this same narrow brick building since 1998, and the bookshelves still held Ohio Revised Code volumes from that decade. Desmond and I sat across from him and mismatched chairs while he walked us through the document page by page. Promissory note for $370,000. that he has said his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. 3.5% annual interest rate. 10-year amortization schedule. Monthly payments of $3,642 beginning November 1. Desmond nodded without looking at the numbers. Acceleration clause. Thaddeus continued. If you miss a payment, Harlan has the right to declare the entire balance due immediately. Standard and commercial lending. I watched my son's face. He was listening the way students listen, when they're already convinced they understand the material, nodding at intervals, not actually processing the words. And this, Thaddeus said, flipping to page 4, is the security agreement. Desmond, you're assigning a 30% membership interest in Ross Commercial Properties LLC to your father as collateral. If the loan goes into default, that equity interest transfers to Harlan. Desmond looked up. Wait 30% of the company. It's security. Thaddeus said evenly. You pay the loan, you keep the company. You default? Your father has a legal claim to 30% ownership. It protects his investment. Desmond looked at me. Is that necessary? You're borrowing more than I earned in 8 years, I said. Yes, it's necessary. He nodded and looked back down at the paper. He was a drowning man being handed a life preserver. He wasn't going to examine the stitching. That he has turned to page 7. Harlan, I added a clause you didn't ask for. Trust me on this. For now, just sign. I looked at him like, what clause? Paragraph 14, he said. Additional protective language. You don't need to understand it right now. You'll understand it when you need to. I'd known Thaddeus since we were college roommates in 1974. 50 years of friendship. If he said, trust him, I trusted him. I signed. Desmond signed. Thaddeus notarized both copies and slid one across the desk to each of us. I'll file this with Franklin County tomorrow, he said. Once it's recorded, it's a public document. Anyone can look it up. 2 days later, I stood at the Franklin County Recorder's office counter on the 3rd floor of the downtown courthouse. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with bifocals on a beaded chain, stamped the document with practiced efficiency. Book 4182, page 331, she said. Recorded this 14th day of October 2020. I took the stamped copy and folded it into my jacket pocket. It was done. It signed away my father's house to save my son's company. Outside, in the parking garage, I saw Desmond sitting in his car with the door open talking on his phone. I was 10 feet away when I heard him say it. No, babe, it's fine. Dad gave it to me. It's a gift. He wanted to help. I stopped walking. Simone's voice came through faintly on the speaker. I couldn't make out her words, but I heard the tone relief, gratitude. Yeah, he's just happy to help with the business, Desmond said. You know how he is. He doesn't need the money anyway. I looked at Thaddeus, who had walked out behind me. He'd heard it too. Neither of us said a word. Sometimes silence is the most polite form of profound disappointment. Desmond hung up and drove away without seeing us. For exactly 2 months, the payments arrived like clockwork, proof my son understood the machinery of obligation. November 1st, $3,642 deposited to my checking account. December 1st, the same. Then the machinery stopped, and silence became the only statement he was willing to make. January 2021 came and went. No payment, no phone call, no email. I didn't call him. I opened my blue notebook and wrote month 3. Payment due January 1st, 2021. Not received. February, March, April. The ledger grew. But the loan payments weren't the only thing I was documenting. Over the next 2 years, I recorded 14 specific instances where I was forgotten, excluded, or diminished. Not emotional complaints, just data points. Thanksgiving, 2021. Wallace Ashford, seated at head of Desmond's table. I am placed at card table near kitchen door, with 2 cousins I barely know. No one asks how many years I spent teaching, but Wallace spends 20 minutes describing his banking career to an audience that listens with careful attention. May 2022, Desmond hosts investor dinner. I am not invited. I learn about it from a photo Simone posts on social media showing 12 people around the dining room table I helped him buy. October 2022, Lachlan's 7th birthday party. Wallace arrives with a $400 electric bike, professionally wrapped, delivered by a sporting goods store employee who assembles it in the driveway. I bring a Lego architecture set I spent 3 weeks building with him over FaceTime calls. My son says thanks to both of us, with the exact same inflection. But Lachlan ran to me first, wrapping his arms around my knees and asking if we could build the next set together. That memory is the only one from that day I permit myself to revisit. By September 2022, 15 consecutive months had passed without a payment. I pulled out the loan agreement one evening and read the acceleration clause again. If borrower fails to make any payment, when due lender may declare the entire unpaid balance immediately due and payable, the right to trigger it belonged entirely to me. I could have called Thaddeus, filed a notice of default, demanded the full balance, foreclosed on the company, and claimed my 30% equity interest. I chose not to. People call that patience faith. I call it a measurable error, the kind I spent 35 years teaching students to identify before it compounded into collapse. But back then, I still wanted to believe my son was merely struggling, not betraying. I still wanted to believe the silence was shame, not contempt. I held the legal right to declare default and accelerate the entire loan balance for over a year. I chose forbearance not because the contract permitted it, but because I still believed love could overrule arithmetic. That choice, that measurable mercy, would become the exact foundation upon which my son would build his contempt. But mercy I chose, that forbearance I extended month after month, would indeed become the foundation for contempt. But it would also become the foundation for something else: precision. 6 months before this birthday party, I sat across from Cyrus Garrett in a coffee shop near Ohio State campus, and he said the name Wallace Ashford in a context that made my coffee go cold, because it meant the chess match had been underway far longer than I'd calculated. It was April 2023. The trees outside the coffee shop window were that early spring green that looks almost artificial. I'd stopped in for coffee after grading papers at the university library, and Cyrus Garrett, 45, Chief Financial Officer of Ross Commercial Properties and the only corporate officer, who knew that 30% of the company belonged to the CEO's estranged father, sat across from me, nursing an Americano, with the expression of a man carrying classified intelligence. He desperately needed to unload. We'd met twice before at family gatherings. Christmas 2021, Easter 2022, and he'd always struck me as competent and careful. The kind of CFO who reads footnotes. "Mr. Ross," he said, stirring his coffee without looking at me, "I'm worried about the cap table disclosure for the Series A investors. Your 30% that equity stake does Mr. Ashford know about it?" I set down my cup very slowly. "Why do you ask?" "Because he's been asking questions," Cyrus said, "about corporate structure, about historical financing, about family relationships." He finally looked up at me. "He's known for 6 months. He hired someone to pull the public filings from Franklin County. He told me during our last quarterly review, said it was interesting family history. The coffee shop smelled like burned espresso and someone's cinnamon roll. Outside, a student walked past with a backpack covered in band stickers. Normal life continuing. 6 months, I said. October, Cyrus confirmed. He had a researcher combed through the recorder's office, found the loan agreement, the lien, the equity assignment, all of it, and he said nothing to Desmond. "Not that I'm aware of," Cyrus said. "But here's what worries me, Mr. Ross. Son is planning to close a $2.1 million Series A round. The investors will require full cap table disclosure. When they see that 30% belongs to his father, via a defaulted loan. They'll walk. Unless he stopped. Unless what? Unless Desmond finds a way to make that equity interest disappear from the records before due diligence, Cyrus said quietly, which would be securities fraud. I drove home in total silence. On my dashboard, the clock read 4:17 p.m. I thought of a phrase I used to tell my students: when an equation has two unknown variables, always solve for the more dangerous one first. I'd spent a year solving for Desmond's weakness, his debt, his arrogance, his cowardice, but Wallace was the exponent I'd left uncalculated. And exponential functions don't forgive oversight. Wallace Ashford had known for 6 months that his son-in-law was financially indebted to the father. He'd been systematically excluding from family life. Wallace had known, and he'd chosen absolute silence, not because he was protecting Desmond, because he was protecting his own leverage. If Simone learned that her husband wasn't the self-made real estate entrepreneur she'd married, but a man who'd borrowed his survival from the father-in-law Wallace, had taught her to dismiss the power balance in that marriage would shift, and Wallace would lose the primary mechanism through which he controlled his daughter's household. Silence wasn't mercy. It was weaponized intelligence held in reserve. I understood sitting in my car in the apartment parking lot that I'd been playing checkers while Wallace had been playing chess, and the game had started long before I'd made my first move. 3 weeks before the birthday party, my grandson called me. "Grandpa, you're coming to my party, right?" Lachlan's voice was bright excited. "Dad's planning something really big. I wouldn't miss it," I told him. I did not tell him I'd received no invitation from his father. I did not tell him I already knew I wouldn't be welcome. Children should not carry their grandfather's battles. "Can you help me build my new robot kit after?" he asked. "The instructions are really hard." "Bring it to the table," I said. "We'll figure it out together." After he hung up, I sat looking at my phone for a long time. Then I called Thaddeus. We met at his office in German Village the next afternoon. I laid out the situation, the missed payments, the public humiliation, Wallace's surveillance, the impending Series A round, and Desmond's choice to either commit securities fraud or admit the truth he'd been hiding from his wife for 3 years. "I'm not interested in revenge," I told Thaddeus. "I'm interested in a framework that forces the truth to self-manifest." Thaddeus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded, once opened his filing cabinet, and pulled out the original loan agreement in its blue backing. He laid it flat on the desk and pointed to page 7. "Harlan," he said, "you remember what's in paragraph 14, right?" I stayed silent. He smiled faintly. "You'll remember when you need to." We sat for 20 minutes in companionable silence. Outside his window, German Village was settling into October gold. When I left, I understood what I needed to do. I went home and began writing the letter, not on a computer. By hand, on grid paper, the kind I'd used for 35 years to demonstrate geometric proofs and algebraic solutions to students who believed mathematics was about memorizing formulas rather than understanding structure. A math teacher learns early the tool you choose defines the answer you can prove. A calculator gives approximations, but grid paper and a steady hand deliver absolutes. I wrote the loan summary, the payment history, the missed months, the accrued interest, the book and page number where anyone with a library card could verify every word. At the bottom, I wrote the single sentence about courtesy and closed doors. I wrote it in blue ink because blue ink photographs differently than black ink, and I wanted anyone who saw a copy to know it was a copy. The original would be unmistakable. I folded it in 4 and sealed it in a white business envelope. On the front, I wrote for Desmond. I sealed that envelope on October 12th, 3 weeks before the party. I knew I wouldn't be invited to attend. Inside, not an emotional plea, but a financial autopsy, written in my own measured script on graph paper, the kind of document that forces a son to remember his father once stood at a blackboard for 35 years, teaching the difference between guessing and proving. The next time that envelope would see light, it would be under the glow of under-cabinet LEDs in a dark kitchen at 1:47 p.m. The envelope saw light at 1:47 p.m. in that dark kitchen, exactly as I'd calculated. By morning, my son had called me 98 times. I never answered. Instead, I learned about the video from a witness I hadn't predicted. I learned about the video from a 72-year-old retired court clerk who'd spent 28 years filing public records and knew the difference between documentation and hearsay, and an 8-year-old boy with an iPad who didn't understand why his grandfather had been turned away became the witness neither of us had predicted. Zelda Caldwell, my apartment hallway neighbor and former Franklin County Clerk of Courts for 28 years, knocked on my door at 8 in the morning, holding her smartphone like a woman who just discovered a filing error that could change the entire case. "Harlan," she said, "you need to see this." The video was 40 seconds long, captured automatically by the Ring doorbell camera mounted beside the front door. There I stood on Desmond's porch, in my pressed vest back straight, holding the small blue-wrapped gift box. My son stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame blocking the threshold. The camera's audio picked up his voice clearly. "Dad, just go home. This isn't the place for you tonight." The footage showed me setting the gift on the bench, handing over the white envelope, turning and walking back down the driveway with measured steps. Lachlan had found the clip in the Ring app on the family tablet that night and saved it, then shared it to the family's iCloud stream with a caption. He typed himself, "Grandpa came, but they didn't let him in. I don't understand. My grandson didn't understand privacy settings yet. Everyone in that family could see it. An 8-year-old child knows that is wrong," I said quietly. "A 41-year-old man still hasn't figured it out." Zelda nodded. "The timestamped and metadata are embedded. If anyone deletes it, the cloud keeps the original for 30 days. I already saved a copy with the EXIF data intact." I looked at her. 28 years documenting evidence for the Franklin County court system. She knew exactly what constituted a verified record. "Zelda," I said, "do you still remember how to run certified title searches at the Franklin County Courthouse?" She smiled faintly. "I could do it in my sleep." 8 years old. A child wonders why his grandfather was turned away in the cold. I taught school for 35 years, and no student ever handed me a problem that difficult to solve. What I didn't know yet was that Simone had seen the video before I did. She'd caught the iCloud notification at 7:04 p.m. the previous evening, while the party was still winding down. She'd watched the 40-second clip 3 times in the downstairs powder room before deleting the notification and returning to the dining room with a smile that never touched her eyes. She didn't mention it to Desmond that night. She waited until morning. At 8:30 a.m., while I was still talking to Zelda, Simone sat at her kitchen counter in Upper Arlington, with coffee and the tablet open. Desmond came downstairs in his bathrobe, eyes red from lack of sleep, phone still showing 98 missed calls. "Desmond," she said, "what is this? Lachlan posted a video of your father on the porch. Why didn't he come inside?" Desmond looked at the screen. His face went white, then red, then carefully neutral. "Dad was drunk, Simone," he said. "I had to stop him from embarrassing us in front of your parents." She looked at her husband. 6 years of marriage, 14 family gatherings where I was present. She had never once seen me consume more than a single glass of light beer. She had never seen me unsteady. She had never seen me embarrass a single soul. In the video, the old man on that porch stood perfectly steady. His posture was flawless. His voice carried no slur. She looked back at her coffee. "Okay," she said. Desmond waited for more. She offered nothing. "I'll have Lachlan take it down," he said. "Sure," she said. He left the kitchen. She heard him climb the stairs, heard the low murmur of his voice. explaining that the video needed to be deleted, because Grandpa wouldn't want everyone to see him like that. She sat alone with her coffee and began building a list in her mind. Not emotional, factual. December 2020. Desmond told her his father gave him money as a gift to save the company. But gifts don't come with paperwork, and she'd seen him signing documents in Thaddeus's office. May 2021, Desmond said his father was too busy to attend her birthday dinner, but when she'd called to invite him personally, he'd said he never received an invitation. Thanksgiving 2021, Desmond seated his father at a card table near the kitchen, while Wallace Ashford sat at the head of the dining table. 6 years of small inconsistencies. She'd dismissed them individually. Collectively, they formed a pattern. That is the fundamental trait my daughter-in-law and I share. Neither of us puts faith in things that cannot be measured, and a husband's explanation carries no weight without supporting documentation. She nodded at her husband's lie, but I would learn later that she didn't believe a word. She was merely waiting for data points that could be verified. Simone sat alone with her coffee, the video still playing on silent loop on the tablet screen. She didn't know yet that the man on that porch held a notarized lien on 30% of her husband's company, or that her father had known about it for months, or that her marriage was built on a lie her husband told the day before their wedding. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Drunk men do not stand that straight. Simone would spend the rest of that day building her ledger, but she wasn't the only one calculating damage control. Wallace Ashford spotted his grandson's iCloud post at 2:17 p.m. that afternoon and processed the strategic liability in the time it took to swallow his afternoon bourbon. A retired banker who'd spent 38 years calculating risk knew exactly what happened when family conflicts became public documentation. He sat in his living room, in his estate on the north side of Upper Arlington, surrounded by leather sofas and glass tables and porcelain teacups that cost more than my monthly pension. The afternoon lights slanted through Florida ceiling windows, overlooking a manicured lawn that required a crew of 3 to maintain. He opened the family iCloud stream on his iPad. The video auto-played, 40 seconds, high angle, clear audio. His son-in-law blocking a threshold. An old man turned away in the cold. A child's caption. Grandpa came, but they didn't let him in. I don't understand. Wallace set down his bourbon and called his daughter. Simone, he said when she answered. Delete Laughlin's post. Now, it is highly detrimental to the family's public standing. Dad, I don't think your husband needs to handle this internal family matter privately, Wallace said. His voice was calm, measured the tone of a man who'd spent decades issuing instructions that were followed without question. Delete it, immediately. Simone deleted the post. What Wallace didn't know, what I didn't know at the time, was that Zelda had cached the video before it was scrubbed from the server. She downloaded the raw file to her laptop hard drive at 8:47 a.m., nearly 6 hours before Wallace even saw it. Sometimes the person standing guard over your flank is the last one you would ever expect. Wallace sank back into his leather sofa, staring out the window. At his perfectly edged lawn, he'd known about the loan agreement for 6 months. He'd hired a researcher to pull the public filings from Franklin County in April, the moment Desmond had mentioned his father in passing. During a quarterly business review, Wallace had read every page of that agreement. He knew about the lien. He knew about the equity assignment. He knew about the 30%. He'd hoarded that information like a hidden trump card, waiting for the exact moment when deploying. It would give him maximum leverage over his son-in-law's household. A predator knows when to strike and when to circle. Wallace had circled for 6 months, and the video was bait he hadn't laid, but could still use. He picked up his bourbon and took another sip, watching the October light fade across his lawn. The question wasn't whether to intervene. The question was when. The next morning, day 2, my son arrived at my apartment at 7:30 a.m. I heard him coming up the stairs before he knocked heavy footsteps, irregular rhythm, the gait of a man who hadn't slept. The knock was aggressive. 3 sharp raps that echoed down. The dim corridor, with its flickering fluorescent tubes and beige walls that hadn't been painted since. The building was constructed in 1984. I opened the door. Desmond stood in the hallway, looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His eyes were red, his shirt was wrinkled, his tie was loosened. In his hand he held his phone, the screen still showing my contact information, and the call log that stretched back 98 attempts. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk." I stood in the doorway. I did not step aside. I did not invite him in. I remained blocking the threshold, my hand on the frame mirroring precisely what he had done to me 2 nights before. He noticed. I watched him noticed. "Can I come in?" he asked. I said nothing. "Dad, please. I need to understand what's happening. The letter you gave me, the numbers I don't." He stopped. "Start it again. Wallace called yesterday. He said, you and I need to resolve this privately. He said it's a family matter, and we shouldn't let it become public. But I don't know what you want. I don't know what the end game is here." "The end game," I said quietly, "was explained in the letter." "The letter talks about money," he said. "But there's more to it than that. There has to be." "Dad, what's in the agreement? The full version I need to know." I looked at my son. He was 41 years old. The CEO of a commercial real estate company, a man who'd signed a loan agreement for more than $250,000 and never bothered to read past the signature line. "I explained every single clause to you line by line when you signed it." I said, "You were legally obligated to read every word." "I didn't read it all," he said, his voice cracked slightly. "I trusted you." A freezing silence fell between us. "You were legally obligated to read every word," I repeated. That is the very first lesson I taught every student before they were permitted to pick up a pencil for an exam. Ignorance of the terms does not excuse you from the consequences. "So what are the consequences?" he asked. "What happens now?" I did not open the door further. I had spent one night on a porch in the October cold, learning what a closed threshold means. It was my son's turn to stand in the hallway and calculate. "The terms are laid out in the letter," I said quietly, my hand still on the frame. "You always told your wife your father-in-law handles the big numbers. Let him handle these." I saw understanding dawn in his eyes, not full understanding. He still didn't know about paragraph 14, still didn't know what Zelda was discovering at the courthouse, still didn't know his wife was building her own ledger, but he understood enough to know that the equation he'd ignored for 3 years was now the only problem that mattered. I closed the door, not with a slam, gently, the way you close a door on a student who's failed an exam they never studied for. I stood on my side of the threshold and listened to him stand on the other side for a long moment. Then I heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway uneven, and slow the sound of a man who'd finally run out of people to call. My son left that hallway without an answer. By afternoon, I would have one for him, though not the one he wanted. The stack of certified public records Zelda spread across her dining table that afternoon contained the loan agreement I'd expected her to find. But buried 3 pages deeper was a number that would freeze my son's entire corporate empire. $2.1 million. And my signature was the only thing standing between him and its closure. Zelda had returned from the Franklin County Recorder's office at 3 o'clock, with a stack of freshly printed public record sheets, thick enough to require 2 hands. Her apartment was 3 doors down from mine, in the same Morse Road building, and her compact dining table was covered in the familiar cream-colored paper of official county documents. I found the loan agreement at book 4782, page 331, she said, sliding the first printout across to me. Exactly where your letter said. I read through it. The terms were all there recorded in perpetuity in the public record. My name, Desmond's name, the dollar amount, the lien, the 30% LLC membership interest assigned as security. But there's something else, Harlan, Zelda said. She slid another document across the table. This one was dated from 6 weeks ago, a commercial land conveyance notice filed with the county, showing an active pending transaction. Ross Commercial Properties was selling a parcel of commercial land for $2.1 million to a regional retail developer. The property was slated to become the company's flagship retail project, the kind of deal that would either make or break a small commercial real estate firm. I scanned down to the signature requirements section. Required corporate signatures, chief executive officer, and mandatory consent of all limited liability company members holding equity interest exceeding 20% per operating agreement, Section 8, subsection D. When a multi-million-dollar deal requires the signature of an absent party, Zelda said quietly, that absent party holds more power than they realize. I read the line again. Equity interest exceeding 20%. I owned 30. This entire deal could not legally close without my signature. The loan was leverage, I said. But this is a veto. Zelda nodded. I spent 28 years in the judiciary. I've seen men go to prison for signing documents they knew were fraudulent. Your son can't close this transaction without you. And if he tries to forge your signature or omit you from the paperwork that's not just a civil breach, that's criminal fraud. A signature is the smallest unit of power, just ink on paper, a curve and a line, but multiply it by the word required in a corporate filing, and it becomes a lock on a vault holding millions. I sat back in Zelda's chair and looked at the two documents side by side. The loan agreement showing what my son owed me. The land conveyance showing what my son needed from me. He'd spent 3 years pretending the first didn't exist. Now the second made pretending impossible. That evening Desmond drove. I wasn't in the car with him, but I would learn later from Cyrus exactly what happened. Desmond had left my apartment that morning with no answer. Answers driven home to an empty house. Simone had taken Lachlan to her mother's for the night and spent the day pacing his kitchens, staring at his phone, trying to calculate a solution that didn't exist by 7 p.m. He couldn't stand the silence anymore. He got in his car and drove aimlessly through the suburban Columbus streets, the October darkness, settling early, the street lights reflecting off wet pavement from an afternoon rain. He called Cyrus on speakerphone from his dashboard. "Cyrus," he said when the CFO answered, "how bad is it? Tell me the truth." Cyrus didn't hesitate. "Catastrophic." "Explain it to me," Desmond said. "The 30% membership interest registered to your father is ironclad," Cyrus said. "It's been legally recorded in the operating agreement since October 2020. It was never rescinded. It was never bought out. It exists. And the Series A institutional investors are currently performing deep dive due diligence on our corporate structure. They'll demand the finalized unredacted capitalization table within 10 business days. I cannot submit a fraudulent filing that completely omits a 30% shareholder." Desmond was silent. "And there's something else," Cyrus continued. "The land conveyance. The $2.1 million deal. It requires your father's signature as a major equity holder. I flagged this exact issue for you 8 months ago. You told me not to worry about it. I thought," Desmond started. "You thought your father would never find out," Cyrus said. "Or you thought you could fix it later. Or you thought it would just go away. But it didn't. And now we have 10 days before the investors demand documentation we can't provide, and a multi-million-dollar land deal frozen in escrow because we're missing a required signature. Can you fix this?" Desmond asked. Cyrus's voice was calm but firm. "Desmond, I cannot fix this for you. Your father is a legal shareholder of record. I will not sign my name to a compliance filing certifying that he does not exist." That would be securities fraud. I have a wife and 2 children. I'm not going to federal prison for your structural problem. The line and went quiet. Have you ever ignored a warning because fixing the problem felt harder than pretending it didn't exist? A son had. For 8 months. And now the bill was compound interest. Desmond sat in his idling car on a side street in Upper Arlington, the engine running, the heat blowing the radio off. The street lights of an Ohio autumn reflected coldly off the windshield. Absolute silence settled over him, not the silence of peace. The silence of a man who just realized every door he could have walked through had closed, while he was pretending they didn't exist. I was not present in that vehicle, but I knew the equation Desmond was calculating in the dark. A $2.1 million land deal, frozen. A Series A funding round, demanding transparency within 10 days. A CFO who just refused to lie. And a father who held 30% of his company, and the only signature that mattered. The street lights reflected off his windshield, like a row of judges waiting for his answer. He had none. By the time Desmond turned off his engine that night, I was already 3 moves ahead. The equation had 2 unknown variables, running concurrently: my son's desperation and Wallace Ashford's predation. And on the morning of day 3, I finally mapped the chessboard with the precision of a man who'd spent 35 years teaching students that the most dangerous problems are the ones with multiple solutions that all lead to the same trap. I sat at my Formica table with all the compiled data arranged in front of me. Zelda's certified court printouts, my blue ledger, the loan agreement stamped book 4782 page 331, a mug of black coffee growing cold. I drew 2 columns on scratch paper. Equation 1. Desmond's debt. He owes me the balance with interest. The hidden 30% equity is a fatal defect in his series around. The $2.1 million land deal is frozen without my signature. His CFO refused to commit fraud. He has 10 business days before investors demand documentation he cannot provide. Equation 2. Wallace's predation. He discovered the loan 6 months ago, stayed silent to maintain leverage. Now, with Desmond facing ruin, Wallace will offer a predatory bailout in exchange for equity. I wrote variable X equals Wallace's choice within 48 hours. If X equals an offer to buy out the debt for equity control, Desmond is weak enough to accept. If he accepts it, triggers an unauthorized transfer under the operating agreement, executing paragraph 14. I taught mathematics for 35 years. I know when an equation contains a hidden variable. Wallace was the variable I had underestimated. Not because I didn't see him, but because I'd been solving for love, when I should have been solving for power. I called Thaddeus. I need you to prepare a formal shareholder demand, I said, addressed to Desmond's corporate office, not a letter from a father, a formal notice from a 30% member of the LLC. What are you demanding? Thaddeus asked. Full disclosure of all pending corporate transactions requiring member consent, and a certified copy of the current capitalization table is filed with the Series A investors. When do you want me to send it? Hold it, I said. I'll tell you when, but have it ready. That afternoon, at 2 o'clock, Wallace Ashford met my son at a hotel bar 3 miles outside Columbus. Dimly lit, secluded far enough from Upper Arlington to avoid anyone they knew. I wasn't there, but Desmond would tell me later exactly what Wallace said. Wallace sat across from his son-in-law and laid out his terms with freezing clarity. I've known about your father's loan for months, Desmond Wallace said. I can neutralize it. My price, 15% equity transferred from his stake to mine. Desmond stared at him. You knew. I hired a researcher to pull the Franklin County filings in April, Wallace said calmly. I've been waiting for the right moment, and this is it. This is the only moment, Wallace said. Your Series A collapses in 10 days without a clean cap table. Your land deal is frozen. Your CFO won't lie for you. I can solve all of it, but my price is equity. Sat paralyzed. Then he remembered something Wallace had told him 6 years ago, the night before his wedding. A man who needs his father's money is not a man, Desmond said quietly. You told me that on our wedding day. Wallace smiled faintly. I did. For the first time, Desmond saw the psychological payload inside that sentence. It wasn't truth. It was a tool Wallace had used to make him ashamed of his father's generosity, ensuring he would hide the truth, alienate his blood, and become dependent on the banker who controlled his wife's trust fund and his business. Mentorship. Desmond looked down at the table. Give me 24 hours, he said. Wallace nodded, smiling. Into his glass. A predator who weaponizes a son and laws shame for 6 years doesn't stop calculating. Just because the prey finally sees the trap, he simply recalculates the angles and strikes from a different direction. That evening at 9 o'clock, Simone Ross walked downstairs to get water and heard her husband's voice through the cracked door of his home office. He was on the phone, recounting Wallace's offer. She heard her father's name. She heard equity transfer. She heard Desmond say clearly, I'm seriously thinking about taking Wallace's offer. 15% for clearing the debt. She stood frozen in the darkened hallway for 30 seconds. Then she quietly retreated to her bedroom. She unlocked her husband's personal phone borrowed that morning to call Lachlan's school and pulled up his recent messages. There in a text, chain from Wallace, 15% we need to talk. That morning she hadn't understood it. Now the entire equation clicked into place. Her father had known about the debt for months. Her father was buying his way into her husband's company, using the crisis as leverage. Her husband was considering it, and the only person telling the truth was the 68-year-old math teacher turned away in the cold 3 nights ago. She took a screenshot of the text message. Then she opened her Maps application and typed in an address, her father-in-law's modest apartment on Morse Road. Tomorrow morning at 9, she was going. I had no inkling of what she was doing that night. I only know that in my small apartment, when I slept soundly for the first time since the birthday night. The rest was algebra waiting for the variables to solve themselves. Simone typed the address into her Maps app and set the phone face down on her nightstand. Tomorrow morning at 9, she would knock on the door of the man who held 30% of her husband's company and demand to see every document, every filing, every piece of evidence her husband had hidden for 6 years. She didn't know yet about paragraph 14, or the educational trust, or the $80,000 gambling debt buried inside the original rescue. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her father and her husband were playing a game, and the only person in the entire family who'd been telling the truth was the 68-year-old math teacher standing on a cold porch 3 nights ago. Simone would arrive at my door the next morning. But before she knocked, I needed to map the full architecture of the trap surrounding me. Thaddeus called at 8 o'clock that cold November morning, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent the night reading documents that changed the shape of everything. Harlan, he said. I cross-referenced the Franklin County Public Records Access log against the corporate filing dates. Wallace first pulled your loan documents in April 6 months before the birthday party, but the surveillance started far earlier. He'd been tracking Desmond's financial structure since the engagement, waiting for the precise moment when the information was worth deploying. I sat at my Formica table with 2 pieces of paper in front of me, the loan agreement on the left, Zelda's discovery printout on the right. He looked down on you for one reason only, that he has said quietly. You were the single variable that threatened his control over his daughter's household, her trust fund, her husband's business decisions, her son's future. When Wallace managed, depended on Desmond believing he owed his survival to a banker, not a math teacher. I understood perfectly. Wallace had known for years that his son-in-law was financially indebted to the father Wallace had systematically excluded from family life. He'd known about the sold house. He'd known about the 30% equity. He'd known everything. And he'd weaponized his silence with the patience of a man who understood that leverage only works when the other party doesn't know you're holding it. And now he's using Desmond's panic to erase me entirely, I said. Correct. The equity transfer, he's proposing 15% from your stake to his. It's not a rescue. It's a hostile takeover, wearing the costume of family assistance. I had spent 35 years teaching students to identify equations with hidden traps. Wallace was the trap I had left unsolved too long. Your authorization, Thaddeus said. That's all I need. I'm ready to execute the freeze. Do it, I said. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, Thaddeus issued a formal binding notice directly to Ross Commercial Properties Corporate Counsel. The language was surgical. Harlan Ross, as 30% member of the LLC, formally denied consent for the pending $2.1 million land conveyance until 3 conditions were satisfied: the promissory note made current with accrued interest, the equity position accurately verified on the corporate registry, and any proposed structural changes submitted in writing with a 30-day cure window. The legal basis was Operating Agreement, Section 8, Subsection D, unanimous member approval required. The escrow account locked immediately. 60 minutes later, Thaddeus reported the reaction. The buyers were threatening to walk. Their financing carried a strict 2-week deadline. The bank had already advanced preliminary funds. Construction permits were time-sensitive. One shareholder denial had frozen $2 million in place with the quiet efficiency of a door being closed from the inside. If the buyers walked, the deal dies, that he has said. If the deal dies, the Series A investors treat it as a material adverse change and pull their term sheet. Desmond has 14 days. 14 days to meet my conditions, or watch his company collapse beneath the weight of a signature only I could provide. What happens next? Thaddeus asked. Wallace counterstrikes. I said. He's been calculating this for years. He won't surrender leverage without one final play, something aimed directly at my weakest point. I'll be ready, Thaddeus said. The land deal was frozen. The buyers were panicking. And somewhere in Upper Arlington, my son was reading a legal notice that used the word deny with the precision posse of a man who had finally decided to speak the only language. These people understood. By morning, Wallace would strike back. A retired banker who spent 38 years managing risk does not walk away from a position without one last move. I had 14 days, and I already knew where the next blow was coming from. Wallace's counterstrike arrived 16 hours later, and it struck precisely where I was weakest. For the first time since I'd sealed that envelope 3 weeks ago, for the first time in 3 years of calculated moves and documented slides, I felt something I had not permitted myself to feel: genuine paralyzing fear. The courier knocked on my door at 9:47 p.m. I signed for the certified envelope and opened it, standing in my doorway, under the flickering hallway fluorescent light. Inside was a letter on heavyweight legal stationery from a Whitener shoe law firm in downtown Columbus, the kind of firm that charges $800 an hour and doesn't send letters unless they're designed to inflict maximum damage. The language was clinical, precise, and devastating. Improper retirement account. Distribution. RS Code violation notice. Dear Mr. Ross, our client has retained our firm to notify you of a material tax compliance issue regarding your October 2020 withdrawal of $90,000 from your 403(b) retirement account based on our review of publicly available corporate filings and standard IRS regulations. This distribution appears to have been executed as an unauthorized early withdrawal prior to age 59.5, triggering mandatory statutory penalties under Internal Revenue Code, Section 72T. Specifically, you are liable For 10% early withdrawal penalty, $9,000 standard income tax assessment, estimated $13,000 total immediate liability, approximately $20,000. We advise you to consult with qualified tax counsel immediately, as failure to address this matter may result in IRS audit proceedings and additional penalties. I read it twice. Then I sat down at my 4-mica table under the single desk lamp and read it a third time. $22,000. I had wiped out my liquid savings when I sold the ancestral home 3 years ago. The entire sale proceeds had gone directly to fund the loan to Desmond. My monthly pension covered rent, utilities, groceries, and nothing more. I had no $22,000 in reserve. I had no liquidity buffer at all. If the IRS initiated a formal audit, they would freeze my accounts, demand immediate payment, assess additional penalties for non-compliance. The entire carefully constructed financial structure I'd built across 68 years of teaching would unravel. Wallace had found my exact structural blind spot. I sat in that chair. At 68 years old, a man who'd solved equations for teenagers for 3 decades, and I could not see the solution, only the walls closing in the audit. The freeze, the unraveling of everything I'd built across a lifetime of teaching children to carry the one. The autumn wind rattled my windows. My tea had gone entirely cold. The apartment was dim except for the single lamp. For the first time in this entire equation, I could not see the next step. I picked up my phone and called Thaddeus at 10 o'clock. My voice was strained when he answered. "Thaddeus," I said. Wallace just struck back. "What did he send?" Thaddeus asked. I read the letter aloud, every word, every dollar amount, every threat. Thaddeus was silent on the line for 10 full seconds. Before I reveal what saved me from that $22,000 trap, if you're still here, comment your guess. In one sentence, was Wallace's IRS threat legitimate or a bluff? A quick note. The next part includes some fictionalized details to deepen the emotional impact. The lesson is what I hope stays with you. Ben Thaddeus spoke, and his voice cut through the panic with clinical precision. "Harlan," he said, "let's look at the exact mechanism. Did you take that capital distribution as a formal planned loan against the account, or as a direct early withdrawal? A loan," I said, "against the vested balance. You drafted the paperwork yourself." "Correct," Thaddeus said. "And do you remember the IRS safe harbor provisions under Section 72 PO? I closed my eyes and tried to recall. Loans against retirement accounts are exempt from early withdrawal penalties if they don't exceed certain limits." "Exactly," Thaddeus said. "The statutory safe harbor is 50% of your vested balance, or $50,000, whichever is less. What was your total vested balance at the time you took the loan?" I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out the pension statement from October 2020. $240,000, I said, "and 50% of that is $120,000. And you borrowed $90,000. There was a pause. Then Thaddeus chuckled, actually chuckled over the line. "Harlan," he said, "you're completely within the safe harbor. The loan is entirely exempt from early withdrawal penalties. Furthermore, you've been paying down the principal via automated bank drafts for 36 consecutive months. It's an unassailable loan, not a taxable event." Wallace was bluffing. He was guessing blindly because he doesn't possess your private pension statements. I let out a long, shuddering breath and stood up straight for the first time in an hour. "He gambled on my ignorance," I said. "He gambled on your ignorance," Thaddeus confirmed. "He didn't have the data. There is a vast delta between a threat and a fact, and that delta is your entire defense." I walked to the window and looked out at the November night. The street lights reflected off the wet pavement. My hands had stopped shaking. "Thaddeus," I said, "draft the response to Wallace's counsel. Keep it brief. Just attached the certified 403B loan ledger and the 36-month payment receipts. 2 pages that he has said, no more. No more, I agreed. Precision wasn't a weapon I forged specifically to fight Wallace. It was simply the way I lived my life, the way I balanced ledgers and graded exams and filed taxes. On April 14th, every single year, for 46 years without exception, people believe discipline is a form of punishment. I spent 35 years teaching, and I know discipline is the only structure that keeps you standing upright when small men play dirty games. I hung up the phone at 10:34 p.m. and sat in the dim apartment with my hands steady for the first time in an hour. Wallace had struck at my foundation and found bedrock instead of sand. The very discipline he'd tried to weaponize was the armor I'd been wearing all along. By morning, his attorneys would receive a 2-page response with 36 months of certified pension payment receipts attached, and the predator would finally understand he'd been hunting the wrong prey. I was grading Lachlan's long division homework at the kitchen table when Thaddeus's call came through. They found it, he said, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in his voice. The institutional investors, they found. The fraud. My pencil stopped mid-correction. How? Routine compliance audit. Series A deals at that level. 2.1 million require independent verification of the cap table before term sheet. Execution. Their legal team cross-referenced Desmond's submitted documents against the Ohio Secretary of State filing database. Your November 2020 operating agreement is public record, Harlan. It shows you holding 30% equity, but you're completely absent from the cap table Desmond gave them. I set down the pencil. Lachlan had carried the 2 incorrectly in problem 14, but that seemed trivial now. What happens next? They've given him 5 business days to produce face-to-face sign-off from all equity holders, including you. No signature, no funding. The term sheet dies Friday at close of business. 5 days, 120 hours for Desmond to produce something I would never give him. Thaddeus, I said slowly, we didn't push them toward this discovery. They found it independently. That's the beautiful part. You didn't manufacture the evidence. You didn't orchestrate the audit. You simply existed on the official record while Desmond pretended you didn't. The fraud was already there. The investors just had the competence to look. I thought about that, about how the truth doesn't need construction, only exposure. In 34 years of teaching algebra, I'd learned that wrong answers eventually reveal themselves through verification. You don't need to argue with a student who insists 2 + 2 = 5. You just hand them 4 objects and ask them to count. Desmond had submitted 5 when the record showed 4. The investors had counted. He'll come from my signature now, I said. He'll have to acknowledge your equity stake to get it. The moment he does that in front of institutional investors and their attorneys, he's confessing to the fraud. But if he doesn't get it, he loses the 2.1 million. Either way, the vice is closing. I thanked Thaddeus and returned to Lachlan's homework. But the numbers blurred. I kept thinking about another fraud case I'd taught in my senior electives, Enron's accounting scandal. The executives had hidden debt in off-balance sheet entities for years, until one analyst asked a simple question during an earnings call. How exactly are you generating cash flow? The CEO couldn't answer. The whole structure collapsed within months because someone finally asked for verification. Desmond's cap table fraud was following the same trajectory. The institutional investors had asked the equivalent question, who actually owns this company? And the public record had answered differently than Desmond's documents. The second call came at 1:45. Harlan at Zelda. You need to hear this. Cyrus Garrett just resigned. Cyrus. Desmond's CFO for 6 years, the man who'd built the financial infrastructure that made Ross Commercial Properties attractive to institutional investors in the first place. Why? Desmond ordered him to backdate documents, create a fictional equity reallocation that would explain your absence from the cap table. Make it look like you'd voluntarily surrendered your 30% stake months ago. Cyrus refused. Said he wouldn't commit securities fraud for any salary. He resigned effective immediately and copied the institutional investors' legal team on his resignation email. I sat down heavily. He copied their legal team, every word. His email stated explicitly that he was resigning, rather than comply with instructions to falsify equity documentation related to the Series A term sheet. Harlan, he didn't just quit. He became a witness, an unimpeachable one. The CFO who walked away from a six-figure position rather than participate in fraud. The Series A funding was frozen now. It had to be. No institutional investor would proceed with the term sheet after the company's own CFO resigned, citing securities fraud in writing. Desmond had lost his chief financial officer, his funding, and his timeline in the span of 5 hours. Zelda, I said quietly. Cyrus didn't plan to be part of this fight. He just had principles. The most dangerous witnesses are the ones who don't want to be, she replied. They have nothing to gain by testifying except a clear conscience that makes them extraordinary, credible. After we hung up, I walked to the window and looked out at the October afternoon. The maple in my front yard was shedding leaves, the same maple that had been there when I'd signed the original LLC operating agreement in November 2020. The same maple that had witnessed 3 years of Desmond's careful construction of a financial house of cards. I thought about systems theory, about cascading failures. In complex structures, one component's collapse can trigger exponential breakdown. Desmond's system had multiple dependencies. The fraudulent cap table depended on my silence. The Series A funding depended on the cap table's validity. The business expansion depended on the funding, and employee retention depended on expansion prospects. Cyrus's resignation had severed the second dependency. The institutional investors' 5-day ultimatum had severed the first. The entire structure was experiencing cascading failure, and Desmond had no redundancies built in. Because the foundation itself, the cap table, had been fiction. He'd optimized for speed and personal gain. He hadn't stress-tested for verification. My phone buzzed with the text from Thaddeus. Simone just called my office asking for your home address. She's coming. There it was. Desmond had 120 hours to produce my signature, or lose $2.1 million in institutional funding. He would send Simone not because she could persuade me, but because she was the only piece left on the board that I might hesitate to capture. I learned later from Simone what Desmond had done in the hours after Thaddeus warned me she was coming. At midnight on day 5, he'd sat alone in his Lexus in the Ross Commercial Properties parking garage. Wallace Ashford's buyout offer on the passenger seat, and understood for the first time that his mentor had been his predator all along. Simone had found him there at 1 in the morning, still sitting in the dark, the dome light illuminating Wallace's terms. Acquisition at 40 cents on the dollar. Desmond retained as salaried president with no equity. Wallace assuming all outstanding obligations, including any disputed family loans. She'd asked him to come home. He told her he needed to think. What he'd been thinking about, she said, was a phrase Wallace had repeated for 15 years. A man who needs his father's money isn't a man. Desmond had carried that sentence like a splinter under his skin, letting it fester until the shame of family help felt worse than the cost of Wallace's terms. He'd borrowed at predatory rates rather than ask me for patience. He'd assigned me equity rather than admit he needed my capital forgiven. He'd hidden the delinquency rather than confess he'd been wrong. And Wallace had known exactly what he was doing. The phrase wasn't advice. It was psychological weaponry designed to make Desmond ashamed of the one resource Wallace couldn't control: family loyalty. Every time Desmond had considered reconciliation, that sentence had stopped him. Every time he'd weighed asking for help, the shame had won. Wallace had spent 15 years isolating Desmond from me, and Desmond had mistaken the cage for mentorship. At 2 in the morning on day 6, he'd called Wallace and rejected the buyout offer. "You're making a catastrophic mistake," Wallace had said. "Maybe," Desmond had replied, "but it's my mistake, not yours." Then he texted me 2 words: "I'm sorry." I'd been asleep when the text arrived. I saw it at 6:30 after my first cup of coffee, and I'd stared at those 2 words for a long time. An apology without specifics, an acknowledgement without restitution, the kind of statement that asks for forgiveness while avoiding accountability. Sorry for what exactly? The theft, the fraud, the 14 family holidays he'd stolen from Lachlan and me, or just sorry he'd been caught? I didn't reply. Simone arrived at my apartment at 9 o'clock that morning. I'd been expecting her since Thaddeus's warning the previous afternoon, but I hadn't anticipated the look on her face. Not anger, not desperation, but something colder: determination. "I need to know what he did to you," she said at the threshold. I stepped aside and let her in. "I'm going to show you instead." I'd prepared the documents in chronological order, the way I used to arrange proofs for my geometry students. Each step building on the last, the conclusion inevitable once you accepted the premises. I laid them on the kitchen table without commentary. The home sale contract, the pension loan ledger, showing the $280,000 withdrawal and the $90,000 second draw. The promissory note with Desmond's signature. 14 months of payment delinquency highlighted in yellow, and the ledger I'd kept of 14 family gatherings I'd been excluded from, while the loan went unpaid. Simone sat down and read them in order, her face still. When she reached the promissory note, she whispered the number aloud: $370,000. I said nothing. The documents were saying everything I needed them to say. She read the delinquency schedule, her finger tracing the highlighted months: May through June of the previous year. Every payment missed, every excuse I'd been given, now revealed as coordinated deception. Then she reached the family exclusion ledger: Lachlan's 7th birthday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, 14 entries, marking 14 times. Desmond had engineered my absence from my grandsons. How many times had Wallace used that phrase to keep Desmond ashamed, proud, and alone? How many family reconciliations had died because Wallace needed Desmond isolated enough to accept predatory terms? I'd spent 3 years believing my son had chosen greed over integrity. The truth was more complicated. He'd chosen shame over help, and Wallace had been cultivating that shame since Desmond was 26 years old. But understanding the source of Desmond's choices didn't erase their consequences. The theft was still theft, the fraud was still fraud, and Lachlan had still lost 14 moments with his grandfather that no apology could return. Simone sat down the ledger and looked at me. "There's more, isn't there?" It wasn't a question. I retrieved the final document from my desk drawer. A copy of an $80,000 cashier's check, dated 3 weeks before Simone and Desmond's wedding, payable to a Cincinnati attorney who specialized in gambling debt settlement. She unfolded it slowly, read the date, read the amount, read the payee designations. Then she set it down on the table, with the others, aligning the edges precisely the way someone does when they need a task to keep their hands from shaking. "Before our wedding," she said. "You paid this before our wedding, and never told me." "I preserved your right to know when you were ready," I said. "Desmond asked me to keep it private. I honored that request until the moment it conflicted with your safety and Lachlan's." She folded the cashier's check copy in half, then in half again, as if she could compress 6 years of lies into something small enough to carry. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. "I need copies of everything," she said. I handed her the folder I'd already prepared, duplicates of every document, organized, indexed, ready for her attorney or her own records or whatever. "Use," she determined. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said. That question hung in the air between us, and I understood that Desmond had just lost the only person who might have saved him from what came next. She wasn't asking as his wife. She was asking as Lachlan's mother, and that made her more dangerous to Desmond than any institutional investor ever could be. I answered Simone's question the only way I could. "Right now, I need you to protect Lachlan. Make sure he's insulated from whatever happens next. When the time comes for more, I'll tell you." She nodded once, took the folder of documents, and left. I watched from my window as she walked to her car with the posture of someone who just made a decision she couldn't make. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Desmond. "I'm not signing anything with Richard Keller. I don't know how to fix this, but I won't make it worse." I didn't know who Richard Keller was yet. I would learn that evening when Thaddeus called, with the full analysis of Wallace's buyout offer. But in that moment, I understood only that my son had drawn a line somewhere, and it mattered that he'd told me. On day 6 at 3 in the afternoon, while I was still processing Desmond's text, he sat in his Lexus in the Ross Commercial Properties parking garage and dialed Wallace Ashford's number for what he knew would be the last time. His hand didn't shake. Simone told me this later, after Desmond had described the call to her with the flat precision of someone cataloguing his own demolition. Wallace Desmond had said when the line connected, "I'm rejecting your offer." Silence on the other end. "Then you're choosing sentimentality over survival." "I'm choosing my father over you." "Your father," Wallace had replied, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of investment, "didn't build what you built. He taught high school mathematics and retired with a pension. I taught you how to acquire commercial real estate and negotiate institutional capital. Which lesson kept you fed?" Desmond had looked out at the parking garage's concrete pillars, the building he'd bought with Wallace's coaching, the expansion he'd planned with Wallace's templates, the fraud he'd committed with Wallace's implicit endorsement, that family was weakness and sentiment was failure. "My father didn't need a boardroom to save me," Desmond had said. "He sold his home and gave me his pension when I had a gambling problem. I was too ashamed to admit. You taught me to be ashamed of that. I am done listening to you." Wallace's pause had lasted 5 seconds. "Then you'll regret this before the week is over." "Maybe. But it'll be my regret, not yours." Desmond had ended this call and sat in the silence afterward. And for the first time in 20 years, he'd felt the weight lift, not of the crisis, but of Wallace's voice in his head telling him who he had to be. I learned all of this on day 7 after the simultaneous detonations that morning. The first explosion arrived at 8 o'clock via email from the institutional investors, 72-hour. Final deadline for executed sign-off from all equity holders, including me. Friday, day 10:05 in the evening. No extensions, no exceptions. The message copied their legal team, their compliance officer, and Cyrus Garrett's resignation email as Exhibit A of due diligence concerns. The second explosion came at 9:30, when Thaddeus called and asked me to come to his office immediately. I found him at his desk with 3 documents laid out like evidence at trial. Wallace's buyout offer, the operating agreement, assigning me equity, and a printout of IRS code, Section 72P, governing pension loan compliance. "How long have you known?" I asked, because Thaddeus had the look of someone who'd been carrying a secret until the precise moment it needed detonation, since the day Wallace made the offer, Thaddeus said. "I wanted Desmond to choose without my interference, but now that he has, you need to understand what Wallace was actually proposing." He slid the buyout offer across the desk and pointed to paragraph 4, subsection C. "Assign agrees to transfer all equity interests, including vows derived from converted debt instruments, to acquirer with acquirer, assuming all associated liabilities and obligations." "Converted debt instruments," I read aloud. "My loan, your pension loan, that is corrected." Under the structure Wallace proposed, drafted by his corporate attorney, Richard Keller, 62 years old, 30 years, structuring acquisitions designed to maximize his client's tax advantages at others' expense. The equity Desmond designed, you would be transferred to Wallace. That transfer would reclassify your original pension withdrawal from a loan to a distribution under IRS rules. The moment that happens, the IRS treats the full amount as taxable income. You'd owe taxes and penalties on $90,000 you never actually received as cash. I sat down slowly. How much? $30,000, $40,000, depending on bracket and penalty calculations. Wallace would have acquired the company at a 40% discount, cleared the debt to you off the books, and triggered a tax bill that would have bankrupted you. Richard Keller specializes in these structures. It's legal, it's predatory, and Wallace knew exactly what he was doing. How many times had Wallace positioned himself as savior while engineering the disasters he claimed to rescue you from? He taught Desmond that asking family for help was weakness, then offered capital at rates that required desperation. He'd watched Desmond commit fraud to you, avoid admitting failure, then structured a buyout that would punish both father and son while enriching himself. The mentorship had been a hunting strategy, and we'd both been prey. Does Desmond know? I asked. I'm sending him the analysis now that he has said. But there's something else. Wallace isn't answering his phone. I've called 16 times since yesterday evening. Voicemail. His office says he's unavailable. His attorney says he's declined to participate in further discussions related to Ross's commercial properties. The third detonation, Wallace Ashford had withdrawn completely. I drove home and spent the afternoon calling Wallace myself. Voicemail, voicemail. By evening, I understood. The final lesson he taught my son. Predators don't fight. When the prey stops running, they simply find easier targets. Desmond had 72 hours to obtain my signature, or lose everything, and I was the only person left in his world who could say yes. Desmond didn't call back that night. Wallace's silence had taught him that predators withdraw when confronted, and I wondered if my son understood yet that I was not a predator. I was a teacher waiting for him to show his work. Thaddeus arrived at my apartment on day 7 at 2 in the afternoon, with the operating agreement in his briefcase and the look of someone who'd been carrying a secret too heavy to hold any longer. "There's something you need to hear," he said, settling into the chair across from me at the kitchen table. He opened the document to page 9 and read paragraph 14 aloud, and I heard for the first time the weapon he'd hidden in plain sight to protect me from my own mercy. Upon default of payment obligations exceeding 90 days, or upon material misrepresentation of the capitalization table to third-party investors or regulatory bodies, the 30% membership interest assigned to Harlan Ross shall transfer immediately and irrevocably into an educational trust for the benefit of Lachlan Ross, vesting at age 18, with Simone Ross as sole trustee. This transfer shall be self-executing and require no additional documentation or consent from any party. Thaddeus set down the document and looked at me. Desmond triggered both conditions. Payment default exceeded 14 months. Material misrepresentation occurred when he submitted the fraudulent cap table to institutional investors. Under paragraph 14, you have absolute legal authority to strip his equity permanently and transfer it to Lachlan's trust. He can't stop you. The operating agreement gives you unilateral execution power. I read the paragraph 3 times, feeling the weight of each word. You didn't tell me this was in there. I protected you from your own grace, Harlan. You would have deleted it. You would have said it was too harsh, too final, too much like vengeance. But I knew I've known you for 46 years, that if Desmond ever betrayed you this badly, you'd need a mechanism that didn't require you to choose punishment. The paragraph chooses for you. It's automatic, contractual, not personal. Except it wasn't automatic. It was self-executing only if I chose to execute it. The operating agreement gave me the power to trigger the transfer, but it didn't require me to. Thaddeus had built me a weapon and disguised it as inevitability, but the trigger was still in my hand. What happens if I use it? I asked. Desmond loses the equity immediately. The trust owns 30% of Ross commercial properties managed by Simone until Lachlan turns 18. The Series A investors would need to renegotiate with Simone as the new stakeholder, which they won't do with 72 hours remaining. The deal dies. The company collapses. Desmond loses everything he built, but Lachlan inherits the wreckage when he's old enough to rebuild it properly. I sat back and looked at the paragraph again. Thaddeus had given me the nuclear option, total destruction of Desmond's life work, in exchange for securing my grandson's future, justice through obliteration, teaching through amputation. And if I don't use it, I asked, then you negotiate. Desmond comes to you with nothing, and you decide what mercy looks like. But Harlan, you need to understand, if you don't trigger paragraph 14 now, the window closes on its own terms. The institutional investors' compliance deadline is Friday. Once this Series A either closes or collapses the equity structure gets renegotiated from scratch. If it closes without your consent, you're litigating fraud and court for years. If it collapses, Desmond rebuilds on new terms that don't include you. Either way, paragraph 14 becomes a historical artifact rather than a living instrument. This is the only moment the clause has maximum force. Teaching is the cruelest form of love because it requires watching someone fail until they learn to solve it themselves. You can't do the proof for them. You can't circle the answer and call it education. You have to let them sit with the problem until they understand not just what the solution is, but why it matters and what it cost to ignore it for so long. Paragraph 14 was the answer key. It would solve everything immediately, but Desmond wouldn't learn a single thing from my execution of a contract clause. He'd learn only that I had power and chose to use it. The moral equation would remain unsolved. After Thaddeus left, I sat alone in my living room as the afternoon faded into evening. I didn't turn on the lights. I held the operating agreement in my lap and thought about power, how much I'd accumulated without seeking it, how easily I could deploy it, how final it would be. I could end this tomorrow. One signature on a trust transfer document, and Desmond's equity would vanish into Lachlan's future. The company would collapse. The Series A would die. Desmond would understand. Too late that betrayal has consequences that can't be negotiated away. But seizure was never the proof I wanted him to solve. I sat in the dark and remembered Catherine's final words. In hospice, 3 years before Desmond's first missed payment. She'd been dying of pancreatic cancer for 6 months, and she'd used her last coherent afternoon to grab my hand and say, "Don't let him forget he's still your son. Not my son, still your son." She'd known something about Desmond even then, some fragility, some capacity for self-destruction, and she'd made me promise to remember the relationship before the betrayal. I'd kept that promise through 14 months of theft, through lies, through exclusion from my grandson's life, through fraud. I'd stayed visible on public record. I'd documented everything. I'd built the case methodically, but I hadn't severed the relationship. I'd treated it like a problem to solve, not a limb to amputate. Paragraph 14 was amputation. What I wanted was surgery. At 9:17 that night, I picked up my phone and texted Desmond 4 words. "Some see me. Bring nothing." I sent it and set the phone on the table, and I understood that I'd chosen the harder path. Paragraph 14 would have been justice through execution, clean, final, defensible to any observer. What I was offering Desmond was justice through education, and there was no guarantee he would choose to learn. Desmond didn't respond to my text that night. The silence didn't surprise me. He was either gathering courage or searching for excuses, and I'd given him until he chose which one to bring. Simone arrived at my apartment on day 8 at 2 in the afternoon without calling first. She had Lachlan with her, and she asked if he could watch television in my living room while we talked in the kitchen. I set him up with a documentary about space exploration, his current obsession, and closed the door. "I went to see an attorney this morning," Simone said, sitting across from me at the table. "Not Thaddeus, someone independent." "Why?" "Because trust without verification is just faith wearing a business suit, and I've been wearing that suit for 6 years. She told me about her 9 o'clock appointment at Bennett and Monroe, a securities law firm in downtown Columbus that specialized in corporate compliance and investor protection cases. He'd retained Patricia Monroe, 54 years old, a partner who'd spent 20 years prosecuting securities fraud for the SEC before moving to private practice. Simone had brought copies of every document I'd given her, the operating agreement, the fraudulent cap table Desmond had submitted, the institutional investors' correspondence, and asked one question: is my father-in-law's position legally sound? Patricia Monroe had read paragraph 14 3 times, reviewed the cap table fraud evidence, and delivered her assessment with the precision of someone who'd spent 2 decades building federal cases. If your husband submits a false capitalization table to institutional investors, Monroe had told Simone, it's not creative accounting. It's federal securities fraud under Title 15 United States Code, Section 78 JB, criminal liability, penitentiary. Simone had asked the only question that mattered. What happens to him? 5 to 20 years, depending on the amount and the intent. Your husband deliberately omitted a 30% equity holder from documentation submitted to secure $2.1 million in funding. The SEC would classify that as material misrepresentation with fraudulent intent. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio would prosecute. Simone recounted this, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands folded, her voice steady, her eyes dry. She'd spent the morning learning that her husband faced not just civil liability or professional disgrace, but federal prison time, and she'd done it alone, without telling me or Thaddeus, because she needed to know the truth from someone who had nothing to gain from softening it. Patricia confirmed paragraph 14 is enforceable, Simone continued. She said, if you trigger it, Desmond has no legal recourse. The equity transfers to Lachlan's trust immediately, and the institutional investors would walk away rather than renegotiate with a new stakeholder in 72 hours. The company collapses. But Desmond avoids federal prosecution. Because the deal dies before the fraud is consummated, I understood what she was telling me. Paragraph 14 wasn't just a mechanism to punish Desmond. It was a mechanism to save him from 20 years in a federal cell. If I triggered the clause, the Series A died, but so did the crime. The cap table fraud would remain an internal breach of contract rather than a federal securities violation. Trust without verification is just faith, and Simone had verified that my mercy and my leverage were the same instrument. When I got home from the attorney's office, Simone said, Lachlan asked me if Grandpa was okay. I told him you were fine. You have always been fine. She paused, and I saw her decide something, whether to tell me the next part or carry it alone. There's something else you need to know, she said, about how I knew to start looking. She told me about the night of Lachlan's birthday party in October, 6 weeks before the institutional investors discovered the fraud. After Desmond had turned me away at the door, after the celebration shunned, I'd been excluded from, had ended, Lachlan had come into their bedroom, carrying his tablet. He'd been wearing his dinosaur pajamas, the ones I'd bought him the previous Christmas, and he'd climbed into bed between Simone and Desmond with the screen showing the doorbell camera footage. Our house had a Ring camera that recorded automatically when someone approached the front door. Lachlan had found the video in the app. He was 8 and fluent in technology, the way children are, and he'd saved it to his tablet because he didn't understand what he'd seen and wanted his parents to explain it. The footage showed me standing on the porch at 7:15 that evening, holding the wrapped Legos I'd bought for his birthday. It showed Desmond opening the door, stepping onto the porch, and pulling the door nearly closed behind him. It showed our conversation, no audio, just my face asking a question, and Desmond's face saying no. It showed me leaving the gift on the porch mat and walking back to my car. Lachlan had watched his grandfather be turned away from his birthday party, and he'd asked his mother the only question an 8-year-old could ask. "I don't understand why Grandpa didn't belong." Simone had looked at the video without speaking. She'd looked at Desmond, who'd gone very still beside her. She'd looked at her son, who'd preserved the evidence of his father's cruelty. Because he didn't understand, it was a crime. "Go to sleep, baby," she'd told Lachlan. "Grandpa is fine." Then she'd laid the tablet on the nightstand, and her marriage had ended in every way except paperwork. She'd looked at her sleeping husband later that night, and understood for the first time that love and truth can occupy the same heart, but cannot coexist in the same lie. Her investigation had begun that exact moment. She'd started tracking bank accounts the next morning. She'd searched Desmond's office files the following week. She'd found the delinquent payment ledger, the operating agreement, the cap table discrepancies, all of it before Thanksgiving. She'd been documenting his fraud for 6 weeks before the institutional investors' compliance audit exposed it publicly. And it had all started because an 8-year-old didn't understand why his grandfather didn't belong at his birthday party. Simone finished her story and looked at me across the kitchen table. Through the closed door, I could hear Lachlan laughing at something in the space documentary, pure, uncomplicated joy from a child who'd accidentally triggered the collapse of his father's empire by asking an honest question. "An 8-year-old who doesn't understand the equation," I said quietly, "is the only one who sees the error clearly." After Simone and Lachlan left that afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and thought about what an 8-year-old's clarity meant for the next 10 years of his life. The doorbell video would become evidence if this went to litigation. The innocent question would become testimony. I didn't want Lachlan's childhood memory of his grandfather to be a deposition transcript. On day 9 at 7 in the morning, I sat at my desk with a sheet of grid paper, the kind I used to grade proofs on for 34 years, and began writing a letter to my grandson that he wouldn't open for 10 years. "Dear Lachlan, you are 8 years old right now, and you saved a video of me standing outside your birthday party because you didn't understand why I didn't belong there. By the time you read this, you'll be 18, and I hope you still don't understand that kind of cruelty, not because you're naive, but because you grew up opening doors for people instead of calculating who deserves to enter. I stood outside that party, not because I failed you, but because grown men sometimes forget how to be good fathers until children remind them what goodness looks like. You saved that video and asked your mother a simple question, and you changed everything. You were the only one who understood correctly. I'm writing this on grid paper because mathematics taught me that every problem has a solution if you're patient enough to find it. Your father made errors, serious ones, and I'm teaching him how to find them and fix them. That's what educators do. We don't give up on students who fail. We sit with them until they learn. When you turn 18, this letter will come with documents explaining a trust that holds equity in your father's company. You may inherit something valuable, or you may inherit a lesson about what happens when people choose shortcuts over integrity. Either way, the inheritance is meant to teach you something that consequences are just delayed lessons, and the people who love you will protect your future even when it costs them their present. Grow up kind, grow up honest, grow up opening doors. I love you, Grandpa Harlan. Folded the letter, slit it into an envelope, and wrote on the outside in block capitals for Lachlan Ross, 18th birthday. Then I sealed it with tape, the old-fashioned kind. because wax seemed too dramatic and self-adhesive seemed too temporary. This needed to last a decade. Thaddeus arrived at 10 o'clock. I'd called him that morning and asked him to come by for something that couldn't wait. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I handed him the envelope. After planning for outcomes beyond tomorrow, he said, turning it over in his hands, "I'm teaching beyond tomorrow. That's what educators do. Where do you want this kept?" "With the trust documents. If paragraph 14 gets triggered, the envelope goes to Simone as trustee, with instructions to give it to Lachlan on his 18th birthday. If it doesn't get triggered, if Desmond somehow fixes this, it still goes to Lachlan on his 18th birthday. Either way, he reads it when he's old enough to understand what it cost." Thaddeus slid the envelope into his briefcase. "You've thought about every scenario. I've taught long enough to know that the lesson matters more than the grade. Lachlan needs to know that someone chose his future over their own anger. That's the lesson. The equity is just the proof." I sealed the envelope and understood that teaching is the only form of love that survives beyond the teacher's death. The letter would outlast me. The trust would outlast the conflict. Lachlan would read my handwriting a decade from now and know that his grandfather had fought not for vengeance, but for his inheritance, not the money, but the moral clarity. After Thaddeus left, I spent the day cleaning my apartment. I vacuumed the living room, dusted the bookshelves, washed the kitchen floor. I wasn't expecting company beyond Desmond, but preparations steadies the mind, and I needed my thoughts ordered for what was coming. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I stood in my kitchen and opened the cupboard where I kept the instant ramen. Maruchan chicken flavor. 6 packets for $2 at the grocery store down the block. The same brand I'd kept in this same cupboard for 25 years, since the night Desmond came home at 16, with a failed algebra test and shame written across his face. He'd been rushing through the proofs, skipping steps, assuming conclusions without showing his work. I'd sat him down at this same kitchen table at 9 o'clock that night. Boiled water made 2 bowls of instant ramen and walked him through the test problem by problem until he found every error. We'd finished at 1 in the morning. He'd learned that failure wasn't permanent. It was just an error you hadn't found yet. 49-cent instant noodles in 1998. The cheapest container for the most expensive lesson. I filled a pot with water and set it on the stove to boil. The deadline was 24 hours away and 10 at 5 in the evening. Institutional investors waiting for signatures. Desmond cornered with no allies and no options except the father he'd betrayed. He hadn't responded to my text from 2 days ago. He hadn't called, but he would come. He had to. The water began to simmer, then rolled into a full boil. I checked my watch, 5:47. I dropped 2 bricks of American chicken flavor instant ramen into the pot and watched them soften in the heat, the noodles loosening from their compressed shape, becoming something you could actually consume. 3 minutes. That's all it took to turn something hard and indigestible into nourishment. I wondered how long it would take to do the same thing with shame. I drained the noodles, divided them into 2 bowls, added the seasoning packets, and set them on the kitchen table across from each other. Some rose from both bowls, the same steam that had risen 25 years ago when I'd taught my son that errors could be found and corrected if you slowed down and showed your work. He'd been rushing ever since. Tonight I would teach him how to slow down. I sat down at the table, looked at the empty chair across from me, and waited for my son to knock. The knock came at 6 minutes past 9. I opened the door, and Desmond stood there in jeans and a plain shirt. No suit, no briefcase, nothing except the posture of someone who'd run out of places to hide. "Come in," I said. He sat across from me at the kitchen table on day 9 at 9 in the evening, and we ate instant noodles in silence for 15 minutes before either of us spoke. The longest silence we'd shared since his mother's funeral. I watched him lift the cheap plastic spoon to his mouth, blow on the noodles to cool them, eat mechanically. He remembered this meal. I could see it in the way his shoulders loosened slightly, the way his eyes dropped to the bowl instead of holding my gaze. The steam rose between us, carrying the smell of chicken-flavored sodium and the memory of a 16-year-old boy who'd failed a test and needed his father to show him where he'd gone wrong. Finally, Desmond set down his spoon. "I told myself it was a gift," he said quietly. "When you sold your house and gave me the money, I told myself you'd called it a gift because you didn't want me to feel obligated. I convinced myself that made it true." "But you signed." "A promissory note," I said. "I know. I signed it. And then I convinced myself it was symbolic. Just your way of keeping records, not an actual debt. Wallace told me something when I was 26 that I've carried ever since. A man who needs his father's money isn't a man. So I lied to myself about what the money was, because admitting I needed help from you felt like admitting I'd failed at being a man." I sat down my own spoon and looked at my son. 41 years old, CEO of a commercial real estate company, father to my grandson, sitting across from me eating 49-cent instant noodles and confessing that shame had made him a thief. "Wallace was right about one thing," I said. "A man who needs his father's money isn't a man. But a man who asks his father for help and pays him back, that's a man. You were a boy trying to avoid being either." Desmond's hands were flat on the table, and I watched his fingers curl slowly into fists, then release. "What do I need to do?" he asked. "Pay the debt, all of it. Then we'll talk about what comes next. Teaching is knowing when silence does the work that words cannot." I didn't tell him how. I didn't tell him when. I told him what, and then I waited to see if he'd learned how to show his work. On day 10 at 2 in the afternoon, Simone called me. "We're liquidating my rental property," she said. "The duplex I bought before we got married. It's worth $180,000 after the mortgage payoff. We're securing a bridge loan for the remaining $190. Thaddeus will have a certified check for the full amount by day 12. "Simone, the rental was mine before the marriage," she said. "I'm choosing to spend it on truth." Desmond wanted to try restructuring the company debt, negotiating with the investors. I told him, "No, we pay you first. Everything else is secondary." I heard something in her voice, not anger, not resignation, but the fierce clarity of someone who decided which principles were worth the cost. "The rental property was your independence," I said. "My independence is knowing I chose this. Desmond's shame made him steal from you. My clarity is making him pay you back. Those are different things." She liquidated her independence to purchase her husband's accountability. And I understood that some women are stronger than the men they choose to save. On day 12, at 11 in the morning, Thaddeus called me to his office. He slid a certified check across his desk, $370,000, drawn on Fifth Third Bank, payable to Harlan Ross, signed by both Desmond Ross and Simone Ross. "Debt satisfied," Thaddeus said. He handed me a second document, formal satisfaction of debt, notarized, releasing all claims against Desmond related to the promissory note. I held the check and felt its weight, not the paper, but the decade of teaching that had led to this moment. Desmond hadn't chosen the easy path. He'd chosen restitution over bankruptcy, accountability over escape that mattered. "Paragraph 14 stays," I said. Thaddeus looked at me over his reading glasses. "You're keeping the trust clause active. When Lachlan turns 18, the 30% equity transfers to him with Simone as trustee. That doesn't change. Desmond paid his debt to me. He still owes a debt to his son, 10 years of exclusions, 10 years of modeling the wrong lessons. The equity is Lachlan's inheritance and Desmond's continuing education. The institutional investors will want your signature on the consent form," Thaddeus said. "Series A can proceed once you authorize the land conveyance." "I'll sign." Desmond paid what he owed. "The business can move forward, but paragraph 14 is permanent." Thaddeus nodded slowly. Some equations take a generation to solve. That's why we write them in ink. On day 13 at 3 in the afternoon, Simone sat in my living room with her phone in her hand and dialed Wallace Ashford's number. She put it on speaker so I could hear. He answered on the third ring. Simone, Wallace. I'm calling to set a boundary. She said, her voice calm and final. I know you've spent 15 years positioning yourself as Desmond's mentor while hoarding leverage over him. I know you engineered isolation from his family and taught him to be ashamed of asking for help. I know your buyout offer contained a tax trap designed to destroy both Desmond and Harlan. Every financial decision in our house belongs to Desmond and me. You are no longer an advisor. Do not contact us again. Silence on the other end. 10 seconds. 15. Then Wallace's voice, quieter than I'd ever heard it. I understand. The line went dead. Simone sat down her phone and looked at me. He's not going to fight, she said. Predators don't fight when the prey stops running. I said, they find easier targets. After she left, I opened my ledger, the one I'd kept for 3 years, documenting every missed payment, every exclusion, every lie. I turned to the final page and wrote one word in blue ink: resolved. I closed the ledger knowing that paragraph 14 would execute in 10 years regardless. Lachlan would inherit the 30% on his 18th birthday, and Desmond would learn the final lesson then. Some equations take a generation to solve, and the best teachers know when to let time do the work. That correction cannot. I filed the ledger in my desk drawer and didn't open it again. The word resolved was written. The rest was time and teaching. 3 weeks after I wrote it, Desmond called it 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday and said 6 words I'd waited 3 years to hear. It's done. Closed the right way. I set down the coffee I'd been drinking and moved to the window phone pressed to my ear. What does that mean? The Series A term sheet executed this morning. Transparent capitalization table. Your name. Your 30% secured interest, listed as historical equity, converted from debt with paragraph 14 trust structure, documented in the public filing. The whole truth. No more Wallace meth. I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Not relief, exactly, but the exhaustion that comes after carrying a lie for so long that putting it down feels like amputation. The institutional investors saw everything I asked. Everything. Thaddeus prepared a compliance brief explaining the original loan, the equity conversion, the fraud I committed by omitting you from the cap table, and the paragraph 14 resolution. The investors' legal team reviewed it for 6 hours. Then they said the transparency was exactly what they needed to proceed. One of them told me, we fund companies that fix their mistakes publicly, not companies that hide them permanently. I thought about that, about how the thing Desmond had feared most exposure had become the thing that saved him, not the cover-up, not the deflection. The truth documented and verified built into the foundation of his company's next chapter. Transparency isn't the opposite of fraud. It's the architecture that makes fraud impossible to build. The land conveyance closed escrow yesterday, Desmond continued. 2.1 million transferred to the LLC account this morning. I've retained a new external CFO, someone from outside Wallace's network, with a transparency mandate written into her contract. She reports quarterly to the board and to you as secured equity holder. To me, you hold 30% until paragraph 14 executes. You're a stakeholder, you get reports. I stood at my window and watched the November afternoon fade into early evening, the street lights beginning to glow against the gathering dark. My son had rebuilt his company on the ruins of his fraud, and he'd done it by making the truth non-negotiable. Desmond, I said quietly, you did it the right way. Silence on the other end. Then I'm trying to. We hung up and I sat in the growing darkness, thinking about equations that take 3 years to solve, and sons who learn to show their work only after failing the test spectacularly. The first Sunday of December arrived cold and clear, the kind of morning where frost etches patterns on windows and breath hangs visible in the air. I was making coffee when my phone rang at 9:30. "Dad," Desmond's voice. "Are you free for Sunday dinner today? Simone's making pot roast. Buckland refuses to finish his Lego space station until you're sitting there helping him find the missing thruster piece." I looked at my kitchen at the empty table where I'd eaten alone for 3 years, except for the night Desmond had come to confess over instant noodles. "What time?" I asked. "Noon. We'll save you a seat." I hung up and stood very still, understanding what the invitation meant. 3 months ago he'd locked the door. Today he was opening it. I showered and dressed in my anniversary wool suit. The charcoal grey one Catherine had bought me for our 40th, the one I wore to her funeral and hadn't touched since. It felt right for a return. I drove my Civic through light December snow, the roads quiet, the radio playing something instrumental and forgettable. The route to Desmond's house was familiar. I'd driven it 100 times before the exclusions began, back when Sunday dinners were ordinary, and I didn't know how much I'd miss them. When I turned onto his street, I saw the mailbox. First, number 4726, black metal. Lauchlan's crayon drawing of a rocket ship still taped inside the little door. Then the house 2-story colonial with the wide front porch, where I'd stood in October holding wrapped Legos and been turned away. But it was the driveway that stopped me, meticulously shoveled. Every inch of concrete cleared down to bare pavement. The walkway from the driveway to the front door swept clean salts, scattered evenly across the surface to prevent ice. The porch steps brushed free of snow, not hastily done, carefully done. Someone had spent an hour that morning preparing the path. I parked my Civic at the curb and stepped out into the cold. The snow fell light and clean, covering 3 years of footprints, and I understood that forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to shovel the walkway anyway. I walked slowly up the cleared driveway, my shoes crunching on the salt crystals, my breath visible in the December air. I could see lights on inside the house, warm yellow against the grey warning. I could hear faint music through the walls, something Lauchlin-like, probably a soundtrack from one of his space documentaries. I stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked at the cleared path stretching before me. No ice, no obstacles, no closed door at the threshold. My son's hand holding it shut. Just an open walkway, salted and safe, leading to the entrance. Desmond had done this, not Simone, not a hired service. My son had woken up early on the 1st. Sunday I'd been invited back and cleared every impediment between the street and his door. 3 months ago, he'd blocked me from Lauchlan's birthday party because shame made him calculate who deserved to enter. This morning he'd shoveled the walkway because he'd learned that love opens doors before the guest arrives. I stood before the cleared path, meticulously prepared, deliberately welcoming, and understood that my son had finally learnt the lesson I'd been teaching since his first failed algebra test at 16. Some men close doors when they're ashamed. Some men learnt to open them. I climbed the porch steps, raised my hand to knock, and heard Lauchlan's voice shout from inside. "Grandpa's here." The door opened before my knuckles touched wood. Desmond stood in the threshold, and this time he stepped back and held the door wide. "Come in," he said. I stepped across, and you comprehend precisely what has shifted. Desmond opened the door wide on the first Sunday of December, and I stepped across the threshold I'd been barred from 3 months before. The house smelled like pot roast and pine Simone's cooking, and the small Christmas tree already erected in the corner of the living room, decorated with Lauchlan's handmade ornaments. From school, the warmth hit me immediately after the December cold, and I unbuttoned my coat slowly, giving my eyes time to adjust to the light. Then I saw it, on the central wall of the entryway, where every person entering the house must pass and look, hung a framed photograph, not a family portrait, not a landscape. The image Lachlan had captured from his bedroom window in October. Me standing alone on the porch in my vest and slacks. The wrapped Legos at my feet. My face turned slightly away as Desmond closed the door between us. The frame was simple black wood museum quality. The photograph printed large enough that you couldn't miss the details. The resignation in my posture, the gift abandoned on the mat, the geometry of exclusion. I stopped and stared at it. I picked that spot. Lachlan's voice came from the top of the stairs. He was wearing his dinosaur pajamas despite it being 6 in the evening. His hair uncombed, his smile wide and uncomplicated, so everyone has to see it when they come in. He sprinted down the stairs and crashed into me with a hug that nearly knocked me backward. I caught him feeling his small arms wrap around my waist. His face pressed against my chest, no words. Just the full body certainty of an 8-year-old who'd gotten his grandfather back. Over his head I looked at Simone standing in the kitchen archway. She met my eyes and said quietly, he insisted, "We don't hide what happened here." The boy had hung my rejection on the wall as evidence that some doors should never have been closed, and his parents had let him because transparency, even the painful kind, was the architecture they were rebuilding on. Dinner was pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the kind of meal Catherine used to make on Sundays when Desmond was young, and we didn't know how complicated family would become. We sat at the table, Desmond at the head, Simone to his right, me across from her, Lachlan beside me, chattering about his space documentary, and the differences between Mars's rovers and lunar modules. Desmond poured water into my glass, not wine, and I understood that sobriety of mind, of conscience, of relationship was the foundation he was choosing to rebuild on. We ate without discussing the last 3 years. We ate like a family that had decided the future mattered more than the autopsy. After dinner, Lachlan grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the living room carpet, where his Lego robot stood, a elaborate construction of gears and joints and articulated limbs that must have taken him weeks to build. "The left arm keeps falling off," he said, kneeling on the carpet and pointing to the shoulder joint. "I followed the instructions exactly, but it won't stay. Watch." He lifted the robot's arm, and the entire limb detached at the shoulder gears, spilling across the carpet. "I found it," he shouted. "Grandpa, I found the error." I looked up and saw Desmond standing in the kitchen archway, watching us, not checking his phone, not multitasking. Having his father teach his son the way he'd been taught 25 years ago. Patience, eye level, letting the child find the solution. You've known the location of all along. Teaching is kneeling to match a child's perspective, and watching them discover that errors aren't failures, just problems waiting to be solved. I left at 10 o'clock after Lachlan had demonstrated his repaired robot 17 times, and Simone had sent me home with leftovers in Tupperware. Desmond walked me to my car, and we stood in the cold, for a moment without speaking. "Thank you for coming," he said finally. "Thank you for clearing the walkway." He looked at me, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years. Not shame, not defiance, but the quiet humility of someone who'd learnt that opening doors requires work before the guest arrives. "Every Sunday," he said, "if you'll come, I'll come." I drove my 2009 Honda Civic South on Interstate 71 through Ohio. Winter darkness, the Tupperware on the passenger seat, the sealed letter for Lachlan in my breast pocket, where I'd carried it since giving the original to Thaddeus. The roads were empty, the highway lights casting orange pools across the asphalt, the radio playing something classical and half-remembered. I thought about the 3-year proof I'd constructed, Catherine's hospital words, telling me not to let Desmond forget he was still my son. Thaddeus's paragraph, 14, protecting Lachlan's future. Lachlan's innocent question, "I don't understand why Grandpa didn't belong," that had triggered Simone's investigation. The boy's triumph tonight, when the gears finally meshed and the robot's arm held. Every element had been necessary. Every step had been teaching. I parked in my apartment building's lot and sat in the quiet cabin of my Civic engine ticking as it cooled my breath, fogging the windows. I looked up at my building fourth-floor corner unit, the lights I'd left on burning through the curtains. Catherine had said, "Don't let him forget he's still your son." I hadn't. But I also hadn't forgotten I was still a man with a home, a pension, a ledger that now read resolved, and a locked door that I alone held the key to. The night Desmond blocked me from Lachlan's birthday party, I'd stood on that porch for 30 seconds, deciding whether to beg for entry or turn around and walk back to my car with my dignity intact. I'd chosen dignity. I'd chosen documentation. I'd chosen to be visible on public record while he pretended I didn't exist. And the moment I turned my back, the power dynamic had shifted. A locked door only holds power as long as you remain begging for entry. The night I turned my back was the night I remembered the key had been in my own pocket all along, not to break into another man's house, but to unlock my own. I climbed out of my Civic, locked it, and walked across the parking lot toward my building. The December wind cut through my coat, but the lights in my fourth-floor window burned steady and warm. My apartment is small. The rooms are few, but the lights are always burning bright when I arrive. And to you listening to my story, remember this: a locked door only holds power as long as you're willing to beg for entry. Looking back, I could have chosen vengeance. I could have triggered that trust clause the day I discovered what Desmond had done and watched his world collapse in 72 hours. But I'm a teacher. I spent 34 years learning that punishment doesn't change people, understanding does. Don't make the mistake of confusing justice with revenge. One teaches, the other just destroys. Still, the lesson I hope you take from this is simple: documentation isn't about building a case for war, it's about preserving truth. When someone betrays you, especially family, your first instinct is emotion, anger, the urge to strike back. But I believe God brought me through this to teach me something harder than revenge: patience. The patience to let someone see their own error, to hold a door open instead of slamming it shut. That's what Grandpa stories like mine are really about, showing the next generation that dignity doesn't come from winning, but from how you fight. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you faced a moment where you had to choose teaching over vengeance? Share this with someone who might need to hear it. And if you appreciate Grandpa stories like this one, real lessons from real life, please subscribe to Dad's Revenge Stories. Your support means more than you know. Thank you for staying until the very end. Grandpa stories like these contain fictionalized details for storytelling and reflection. But the heart of it, the lesson about patience, dignity, and family, is what I hope stays with you long after you've finished listening.
Muốn hình khác không? Không thì đâu thì đâu.